What if I told you that one man, with fewer soldiers than a small-town high school football crowd, won America half its land and died broke, forgotten, and in debt to the country he helped create? February 1779. The middle of the Illinois wilderness. A column of 170 men is pushing through freezing floodwater that reaches past their chests. Their clothes are soaked through to the bone. Food ran out 2 days ago. The man leading them is tall, red-haired, just turned 26 years old, and he has smeared black gunpowder across his face like war paint. Every single morning, he is the first one into the water. Behind him, men are breaking through sheets of ice with their bare hands. Some of them can barely walk. A few have to be carried. One small drummer boy floats across the surface on top of his drum just to keep from drowning. They have been marching like this for over 2 weeks, through what the leader himself called the drowned country, and the British fort they are heading toward is still miles away, surrounded by a flooded plain stretching 4 miles wide in every direction. Now here is what makes this story different from every other war story you have ever heard. What nobody knew at the time was that this frozen, starving, half-drowned column of militiamen was about to pull off one of the most decisive military victories in the entire American Revolution, capture territory that would eventually become 5 of the United States you live in today, and then be almost completely erased from the history books. The man leading that march went on to be called the conqueror of the Old Northwest by his own contemporaries. Thomas Jefferson himself once asked this man to lead the first great expedition across the American continent before anyone else was ever considered for that mission. And yet most Americans today could not tell you his name. I have spent years studying the forgotten commanders of the Revolutionary War, and I will tell you this plainly. No story has stayed with me longer or made me angrier at how we choose who gets remembered than this one. The territory this man won, with 170 half-starved soldiers in the dead of winter, eventually produced the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the law that banned slavery north of the Ohio River and laid the foundation for what would become one of the greatest arguments in American history. None of that happens without this march. None of it. So if you have ever wanted to understand how this country actually got built, not in the grand halls of Philadelphia, but in the frozen mud of the American frontier, stay with me, because this is the story that your history textbooks skipped. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found your way to this story, because this one is going to change the way you think about American history. If you have been with us for a while, you already know that we do not do surface-level history here. We go deep, we go honest, and we go to the places the textbooks skipped. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this one, because we are just getting started. Now, before we can understand what this man did in the frozen wilderness of February 1779, we have to understand who he was before any of that happened, because the man does not make sense without the background. George Rogers Clark was born on the 19th of November, 1752, near Charlottesville, Virginia, not far from where a young Thomas Jefferson was growing up on his own family's land. He was the second of 10 children, raised on a modest plantation that started at around 400 acres and eventually grew to over 2,000. 5 of the 6 Clark brothers would go on to serve as officers in the coming Revolution, which tells you something about the family they came from. And the youngest brother, William, born when George was already 18 years old, would one day stand at the edge of the Pacific Ocean as co-leader of the most famous expedition in American history. But that is a story for later, because right now, the boy we need to focus on is George, and George was not a scholar. He was restless in the way that certain young men are restless when the world they can see from a classroom window is not big enough to hold them. His grandfather recognized something in him early on, something that could not be taught from a book, and trained him in the craft of land surveying. That combination of mathematics and wilderness navigation turned out to be exactly the education this particular young man needed. By the time he was 19 years old, he was paddling a canoe down the Ohio River into the Kentucky wilderness alone, sleeping on riverbanks, reading the land by starlight and the bend of the current. staking claims on territory that most Virginians had never laid eyes on. Now here is where the story starts to get complicated, and I want you to pay attention to this part, because this is where we see exactly what kind of man Clark was becoming. By 1776, the American Revolution had ignited back east, but on the Kentucky frontier, the war looked completely different. From their stronghold at Fort Detroit, British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton had been authorized by London to arm and coordinate Native American war parties to raid the isolated Kentucky settlements. The Shawnee war chief Blackfish led 200 warriors into Kentucky in the spring of 1777, and rather than launching open assaults on the fortified stations, they did something far more devastating. They systematically destroyed crops, livestock, and food supplies, aiming to starve the settlers out entirely. The period became known as the Year of the Bloody Sevens, and the numbers behind that name are staggering. From 1775 to 1782, 860 Kentuckians were killed in skirmishes and raids. That is 70 deaths per every 1,000 residents, compared to an average of just 10 per 1,000 across the other 13 colonies. Kentucky was bleeding out, while the rest of the country was fighting a different kind of war entirely. While every other settler was focused on building higher walls and surviving the next raid, Clark was asking a completely different question. He was not asking how to hold on. He was asking how to end it. He sent 2 spies deep into the Illinois country, the British-controlled territory northwest of the Ohio River, and what they reported back confirmed everything he suspected. The British had pulled their regular troops east to fight the main war. The frontier forts at Kaskaskia and Cahokia on the Mississippi River were barely defended. The populations there were mostly French-speaking civilians, with no real loyalty to Britain. And Fort Sackville at Vincennes on the Wabash River was, by most accounts, practically falling apart. Clark traveled back to Virginia in late 1777 with a plan so audacious that it probably should not have worked, and he walked it into a room that included Governor Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, and George Wythe. He told them plainly, "Give me the men, and I will cut off the supply lines feeding every raid on every Kentucky settlement, open a corridor to Spanish allies across the Mississippi at St. Louis, and plant the American flag on territory Britain controls in name only." The council agreed. Clark was promoted to lieutenant colonel and authorized to raise a force of 350 men. And that is where the next problem began, because raising an army on the frontier in 1778 was nothing like signing an authorization letter in a warm Virginia statehouse. After 3 years of war with little to show for it, enthusiasm for volunteering was nearly gone. When Clark finally assembled his force at the Falls of the Ohio, the site of present-day Louisville, he had exactly 178 men. About half of what he needed, most of them untrained militia, no uniforms, and not a single artillery piece to their name. He could have waited. He could have called the whole thing off. Instead, on the 24th of June, 1778, he loaded his men into boats and pushed off into the current. And what happened next is something I want you to understand was not luck. It was a masterclass in how one man's ability to read people, read land, and read the moment can change the course of history. Now, here is something that most people miss when they read about this campaign, and I think it is the detail that tells you everything about how Clark thought. When his boats reached the mouth of the Tennessee River after 4 days on the Ohio, the obvious route to Kaskaskia was to continue downstream to the Mississippi and then head north. But Clark knew the British were watching that route. So instead, he made a decision that sounds almost irrational when you first hear it. He landed his men on the south bank and ordered them to march overland 120 miles through trackless wilderness in the dead of summer. No roads, no resupply lines, navigating by compass, and eating whatever they could hunt along the way. No artillery. No backup. Just 175 men and the conviction that surprise was worth more than comfort. That decision alone tells you that Clark was not thinking like a militia captain. He was thinking like someone who understood that the greatest weapon he had was the one his enemy did not know he was carrying. They reached Kaskaskia on the night of the 4th of July, 1778, exactly 2 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The village sat along the banks of the Kaskaskia River in the fertile bottomland of the Mississippi River Valley, home to around 500 white inhabitants and a roughly equal number of enslaved people and free black residents. The British military had already pulled out, leaving behind only a sleeping French commander named Philippe François de Rastel de Rocheblave and an unsuspecting civilian population. Clark divided his men, sent one group to surround the village, and personally led another across the river in total darkness. They moved through the streets without a sound, seized the commander right in his bed, and secured every building in town before the sun came up. Not a single shot was fired. The entire operation took roughly 15 minutes. And what Clark did next was, in my view, just as strategically brilliant as the capture itself. The French inhabitants of Kaskaskia were terrified. They had been told for years that American frontiersmen were violent and lawless. Clark let them sit with that fear for a few hours, which was either a stroke of psychological genius or remarkably cold-blooded, depending on how you look at it. Then he gathered the villagers and delivered news that shifted the entire room in an instant. France and the United States had just signed a formal alliance. Their mother country was now on the American side. The reaction was immediate and complete. Many of the French villagers swore loyalty to Virginia on the spot. Clark offered them full citizenship, promised to protect their property and respect their Catholic faith, and treated them not as a conquered people but as potential partners. That distinction mattered enormously. Father Pierre Guibault, a local Catholic priest with deep influence throughout the entire region, was so moved that he volunteered to travel to Vincennes himself and persuade the French residents there to do the same. Within weeks, Vincennes and its crumbling Fort Sackville came over to the American side without a single act of violence. Cahokia, Prairie du Rocher, and St. Philip's followed just as quickly. Let that sink in for a moment. Clark had taken an enormous stretch of British-controlled territory with 175 men and zero combat, no artillery, no reinforcements. Just intelligence, speed, deception, and an understanding of human nature that most professional military commanders never develop in an entire career. He was 25 years old, and for a brief stretch of months, in the late summer and fall of 1778, it genuinely looked like he had pulled off the impossible. He was making treaties with local Native American tribes, governing his new territory, and sending dispatches back to Virginia. But history, as Clark was about to learn, does not stay quiet for long, because while he was building something in the West, the man in Detroit was already planning to tear it all down. When word of Clark's takeover reached Detroit, Henry Hamilton did not hesitate. He assembled a force of roughly 600 men, a combination of British regulars, French-Canadian militia, and Native American warriors, and marched south with everything he had. On the 17th of December, 1778, Hamilton retook Fort Sackville at Vincennes. Captain Leonard Helm, the small garrison commander Clark had left behind, was overwhelmed and surrendered. And then Hamilton made a decision that, looking back across more than 2 centuries of history, stands as one of the most consequential miscalculations of the entire Revolutionary War. Instead of immediately pressing west to finish Clark at Kaskaskia, he decided to wait for spring. The Wabash and Embarrass rivers had flooded the entire surrounding region, turning Vincennes into what was essentially an island surrounded by miles of standing water. Hamilton looked at that frozen, flooded landscape and concluded that no rational military commander would attempt to move an army through it in February. He sent most of his Native American allies home for the winter, kept a garrison of about 90 men at the fort, and settled in to wait for warmer weather. That assumption, that no one would be desperate or determined enough to march through the drowned country in the dead of winter, was the crack in the wall that Clark was about to drive a battering ram through. The intelligence that changed everything came from a man named Francis Vigo, a Spanish merchant of Italian origin who had once served as a colonel in the Spanish army and was now operating out of St. Louis. Vigo had been captured by Hamilton's forces near Vincennes and then released after promising to return directly to St. Louis. Instead, He traveled straight to Kaskaskia in January 1779 and told Clark everything: Hamilton's strength, the condition of the fort, the fact that most of his native allies had gone home, and Hamilton's plan to strike Kaskaskia in the spring with a fully reinforced force that Clark would have no answer for. Clark gathered his officers and laid out the situation with the kind of clarity that separates great commanders from good ones. If they waited until spring, Hamilton would have more men, more supplies, and the initiative. Kentucky would fall. Everything Clark had built over the past 7 months would be gone. The only move that made any sense, the move that Hamilton had specifically ruled out as impossible, was to attack now, in February, across nearly 200 miles of flooded wilderness before Hamilton ever saw it coming. Before he set out, Clark wrote a letter to Governor Patrick Henry that I think deserves to be read by every American. He wrote, "I know the case is desperate, but we must either quit the country or attack. Great things have been effected by a few men well conducted. Perhaps we may be fortunate." On the 5th of February, 1779, Clark purchased an old keelboat and converted it into an armed river galley he named the Willing, placing his cousin Captain John Rogers in command with 46 men and sending them down the Mississippi to come up the Ohio and Wabash rivers and meet the main force near Vincennes. The timing of that rendezvous working out was, to put it generously, a long shot inside an already desperate gamble. The following day, February 6, Clark set out from Kaskaskia with about 170 men, nearly half of them French volunteers from the local settlements who had thrown their lot in with the American cause. What followed over the next 17 days is something that I genuinely believe belongs in the same conversation as any feat of endurance in American military history. It rained almost every single day. The plains of southern Illinois were saturated beyond anything the men had prepared for. Within the first few days, they were wading through standing water that covered the ground for miles in every direction. Clark himself called it the drowned country, and that description was not an exaggeration. Food ran out fast. Hunting parties ranged out from the main column trying to find game in the flooded landscape and came back with almost nothing. Captain Joseph Bowman, Clark's second in command, kept a detailed journal of the march, and his entries from those middle days are almost unbearable to read. He noted that many of the French volunteers were talking openly about turning back. Morale was collapsing under the weight of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. And then there was Clark himself, doing the one thing that no military manual can teach and no rank can manufacture. Every single morning, before any other man moved, he was the first one into the water. He cracked jokes when the situation called for gravity. He organized competitions between companies to see who could push through the flooded ground fastest. He kept moving, kept talking, kept projecting a certainty he may not have entirely felt, because he understood that the moment his men saw doubt in his face, it was over. By February 13, they reached the Little Wabash River, swollen to nearly 5 miles wide and several feet deep. They built canoes and ferried men across in shifts, progress slowing to a crawl. By February 17, they reached the Embarrass River, just 9 miles from Vincennes, but the river was too high to cross. They had not eaten in 2 days. Clark later wrote that preventing desertions during those hours was one of the hardest things he had ever done. They followed the river south to the Wabash, spent 2 days building boats, and still there was no sign of the Willing and its desperately needed cannons. On February 21, Clark and his men finally crossed the Wabash using canoes and a captured dugout, leaving their pack horses behind on the other bank. And on the other side, they found the worst stretch yet. Between them and Vincennes lay a flooded plain stretching 4 miles wide. That night, the men slept on a tiny patch of elevated ground with empty stomachs and woke the next morning to find their clothes had literally frozen to their bodies overnight. Clark looked at his men that morning and understood with complete clarity what was at stake. If he did not get them moving immediately, they would not die in battle. They would simply stop, and the cold and hunger would do what Hamilton's soldiers had not been able to do. He stood up, said the words that nobody wrote down but that everyone who was there remembered for the rest of their lives, smeared black gunpowder across his face, let out a war cry, and walked straight into the icy water. He broke through the surface ice with his fists. One by one, slowly and then all at once, his men followed. The water reached their chests. Shorter men had to be pulled along or floated on debris. That small drummer boy climbed on top of his drum and floated across the surface. They pushed through for hours before reaching higher ground on the outskirts of Vincennes. And the British fort they had come 200 miles to take had no idea they were coming. On the evening of the 23rd of February 1779, Clark sent a captured hunting party ahead into Vincennes with a letter addressed to the French inhabitants of the town, warning them to stay indoors and away from the fort when the attack began. That letter was read aloud in the town square. And here is the detail that still stops me cold every time I think about it. Not one single person in that town walked to the fort to warn Hamilton. Not one. The French residents of Vincennes had made their choice, and it was not the British. That night, Clark marched his 170 exhausted, half-starved men into position around Fort Sackville, and then he did one more thing that showed exactly how his mind worked under pressure. He ordered every company flag unfurled. Every banner and scrap of colored cloth they had carried through 200 miles of frozen swamp held high in the air. Then he had his men march back and forth behind a low rise of ground on the edge of town, appearing and disappearing and reappearing in careful rotation, creating the convincing illusion that a force of 600 fresh troops had arrived. The French townspeople watched from their windows and believed every bit of it. Nobody raised an alarm. Nobody ran to the fort. Clark's Kentucky riflemen, some of the finest marksmen on the entire continent, then took up positions behind the houses and fences surrounding Fort Sackville and opened fire with a precision that shocked the British garrison. They poured rounds through the fort's gun ports with such accuracy that Hamilton's men could not open them to return fire. Every time a British soldier showed himself on the ramparts, a rifle ball found him before he could aim. The fighting continued through the night and into the next day. Hamilton's French militia refused to fight. 7 of his British soldiers were already wounded. He was 600 miles from the nearest possible reinforcement. On the morning of the 25th of February 1779, Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, the man the entire Kentucky frontier had called the hair buyer of Detroit, walked out of Fort Sackville and surrendered to George Rogers Clark. Clark had taken the fort without losing a single man. He was 26 years old. Now, I want you to sit with what that victory actually meant, because this is the part that most history classes never get to. The British never reclaimed the Illinois country. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially ending the Revolutionary War, Britain ceded the entire Northwest Territory to the United States. That territory covered what is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a portion of Minnesota. But here is the layer beneath the layer, the part that makes Clark's campaign genuinely one of the most consequential military actions in American history. In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, written directly for the territory that Clark had won with his 170 frozen soldiers. That ordinance banned slavery north of the Ohio River. It guaranteed freedom of religion, the right to trial by jury, and public education for every resident of the territory. It drew the line, literally and legally, between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South, a line that would define American politics for the next 74 years and ultimately lead to the Civil War. None of that document exists without the land Clark secured. None of those 5 free states exist without that march. And there is one more connection that history almost never makes. When Thomas Jefferson first looked west and imagined a great American expedition to explore the continent, the first man he approached for that mission was George Rogers Clark himself. But by then, Clark had already been broken by the country he saved. The mission eventually passed to Meriwether Lewis, who chose Clark's younger brother William as his co-commander. In the winter of 1803, George Rogers Clark, aged and in poor health, sat at his small cabin overlooking the falls of the Ohio and welcomed William and Meriwether Lewis before their departure. He gave them everything he knew, his knowledge of the Western tribes, the geography, the natural world he had studied for 30 years. The man who should have led that expedition into history instead watched it leave from the riverbank. Because the truth is that Virginia never paid him back. He had financed much of the campaign with his own borrowed money, signing for supplies in the state's name, and when he came home, the auditors in Richmond had lost most of his vouchers. The state acknowledged the debt but passed it from committee to committee for years. Creditors came after his land. The man who had once been the largest landholder in the Northwest Territory was eventually left with a single small plot in Clarksville. In 1809, at the age of 56, he suffered a severe stroke, fell into a fireplace, and burned his right leg so badly it had to be amputated. He moved in with his sister and spent his final years largely bedridden. Virginia granted him an annual pension of $400 and a ceremonial sword in 1812, a gesture that came 3 decades too late to mean anything beyond symbolism. He died on the 13th of February, 1818. And in a final irony that I find almost too painful to say out loud, the last payment that the state of Virginia made to his estate to settle what they owed him was made in 1913, 95 years after his death. He wrote it himself in a letter to his brother, in words that I think deserve to be the last thing you hear in this video. He wrote, "I have given the United States half the territory they possess, and for them to suffer me to remain in poverty in consequence of it will not redound much to their honor hereafter." He was right. And the least we can do, all these years later, is remember his name. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, or proud, or both at once, leave a comment below and tell me which part hit you hardest. Share this with someone who loves American history, because stories like this one only survive if people like you decide they are worth keeping alive. And I will see you in the next one.